Energy Transition, episode number 53. Our topic today is Industry and Reality Fighting the Narrative. Good to see you, David Blackman, Ilindislav, and Temi Nimet.
Hello.
Hey,
Hello,
everyone.
everyone.
Hello to everyone around the world. Yes.
Irina, do you see the oil and gas industry getting organized to face the challenges? To face the narratives?
Well, I'm not sure about organized, but I see signs of some courage from the oil industry. They're not just talking about how dedicated they are to the transition as they were just a year ago, making all these commitments and assuring everyone that they will invest more and more in renewable energy and produce less oil and gas because this is what the transition requires. And now suddenly, more and more people from the industry are talking about energy security, including most recently the chief executives of BP and Shell, just a few days ago. Both of them talked about how it is important to continue producing oil and gas. And BP's Bernard Looney even went as far as to say that it's important to produce more oil and gas now to advance the transition, meaning to avoid price spikes in oil and gas. If production shrinks suddenly, which is completely accurate. If there's less oil and gas being produced, prices will spike, and we're still reliant. The world, are still reliant on oil and gas, and this is reality. He is acknowledging the same reality he refused to acknowledge just a couple of years ago, when he said BP is firmly on the path to a transition, and all the rest of it, how they'll be investing more in low carbon technology and reducing oil and gas production. The same happened with the new chief executive of Shell, who highlighted the importance of energy security and who, again, said that we will be needing oil and gas for a long time going forward. I think that just a couple of years ago, this would have been sort of unthinkable, even though his predecessor, Mr. Ben van Beurden, said that as long as the world needs oil and gas, Shell will continue to produce it, and all the other oil companies. So the focus is shifting now to demand. As long as there is demand, there needs to be oil and gas. But at least they're acknowledging this reality that there is demand. It's growing, by the way, expected to hit a record this year. And they are being courageous enough to say that as long as there is demand, they will continue producing oil and gas.
So, David, stop dreaming and coming back to the reality.
Yeah, and I guess this might have been inevitable, although it certainly didn't seem that way with BP a couple of years ago. The reality, as Irina says, is just that the world is not getting off of oil in any real sense. This transition, everyone I've talked to recently has acknowledged that the transition is way off track. It's far behind what the narrative claims. And we're adding a lot of wind and solar capacity and building a lot of electric vehicles. And so far we're able to, source the energy minerals required to fill up their batteries with 2,000 pounds of metal. And, so long as that's the case, we'll be selling a lot of electric vehicles and building more wind and solar. But the reality is demand for energy in general as a whole continues to just increase very rapidly for a lot of different reasons, not just oil and gas. and that has meant anyway that last year we used record amounts of oil and natural gas and coal and wood for power generation, more than we've ever used globally. And this year we're probably going to use more of all of those again. And even as the United States and Western Europe, maintain their conceit that they're leading this energy transition for the world and continue to disadvantage and destroy their economies at the altar of renewables. Pakistan, India, China, other Asian and African and other developing countries around the world are continuing to double down on coal because they need coal to keep their populations warm and fed, and they need oil and gas. And so the demand is going to continue increasing in these developing nations. And, no amount of COP conferences or WEF pronouncements is going to change that. So, yes, I'm glad to see Shell and BP waking up to that reality. They probably never really left that reality. It was just their PR campaigns needed to focus on these other things. And it's nice to see the CEOs talking bluntly about the need to keep producing oil.
But Tammy, the industry have the net zero goal or something intermediate for carbon?
Well, it's interesting to think about how the industry is conceptualizing all of this, because for the policymakers, there seems to be this tension between those who have all the hope of being a society completely run on renewable energy, and then the reality, which is we're not there yet. We don't have the ability to run a modern economy on these things. And so industry is put into a terrible situation where these mandates are being put forward that we want to, Europe and Canada, for example, want to meet Paris commitments. And industry is like, well, okay, if you're saying we have to participate in this transition, we're going to do the best we can. And I was at a natural gas summit last week, and 2 weeks ago, I was listening to an energy panel with representatives from the oil sands pathways. And they were talking about all of this great innovation that they're doing to reduce their emissions, to reduce the methane, to reduce the actual energy intensity of extracting a barrel of oil, which is quite significant. The adaptations that they've made over the past, say, 5 to 10 years to bring that energy intensity down. But the environmentalists criticize them because they're still producing more. So even though they're using less energy and there's less emissions per barrel, they're still producing more barrels. But they've been asked to reduce the emissions to net zero at some point by 2050. And they're trying to do their best to accomplish this. And some of the other innovations that they were talking about was returning the land to biodiversity. So when they've extracted the mining of the oil sands, they try to return that land back to the way it was, and they consult with the indigenous people, and they return it. And nobody knows that they're doing this. They don't advertise it. And so here they've restored actually quite several thousand acres of land, and no one knows about it. And if I could just add one more thing, I heard that Shell was thinking of moving its headquarters to the United States. Have you guys heard that as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
David?
Yes.
They
Yeah.
apparently looked at it and decided not to in the wake of that crazy court decision in The Hague. But apparently they've decided not to do that. That was the gist of the story I read. But I have no inside knowledge about any of that.
This is interesting.
Okay.
Not for California, for sure. Maybe for Texas.
Oh my gosh.
David, at the same time, the U.S. Congress is reviewing ESG rules. Is it correct?
Yes, both houses of Congress actually approved a bill that would repeal block the Department of Transportation from implementing a new regulation requiring ESG reporting that's completely crazy. And, President Biden, of course, going to veto it. because I guess anyway. So yes, I mean there's a growing consensus in Congress, bipartisan consensus. Both houses, it was a bipartisan vote, but not enough to override a veto. You have to have a 2/3 majority to override a veto in our Congress. And but there's a lot of Democrats who are waking up to the menace that ESG really is on the maintenance of energy security. And I hope more continue to wake up. We saw, we've seen some positive sides even from AOC recently, and so yeah, that was a significant event last week, and unfortunately, President Biden's continues to get awful advice from his advisors, and will veto that bill.
Is something related to, let's see, not reduce the business, so facilitate the ESG rules, maybe?
Well, I mean, it's a regulation that's being implemented by the Department of Transportation under the guidance of our wonderful Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who has no qualifications for the job other than he knows how to ride a bicycle. And so, I mean, those regulations came as a surprise to everyone, I think, and the new rule came as a surprise to most folks. And the SEC is also working on an ESG reporting requirement rule, which will burden everyone with a lot of unnecessary paperwork and reporting responsibilities, and really no confidence that anything you report is going to meet the approval of the regulator, because there's no scientific way to really measure all this stuff. And so it's all very premature and unnecessary and ill-advised. And but this is the world we live in the United States right now.
Mm-hmm. But Irina, Greta is against wind energy nowadays. What's happening?
I deliberately missed this particular burst of noise, but from what I gathered, browsing over headlines, apparently the wind farm was supposed to be constructed on indigenous lands and would interfere with biodiversity. I don't know what to say.
In Norway, yeah, it's in Norway. And,
they say it disturbs the reindeer. So if windmills disturb reindeer, what do they do to other livestock?
Yeah, and all those whales that are dying around the US. Not that there is a causal relationship established already with wind energy, but it's a fact. I understand that more whales are dying. But I wanted to say something about ESG reporting in the US. David, what about that Republican bill and the pushback from conservative states against ESG investing as a means of protecting pension funds investments? Right. Because the argument, this is also a positive development, not from the oil industry, but from pro-oil states, oil shield states.
Right.
Because they argue, and there is evidence to support this argument, I gather, that ESG investment funds do not have higher returns. They even have lower returns than traditional investment funds. So I think that states speaking out against this ESG investment drive is another reality check that we desperately need, not just in the United States, but everywhere. But Greta could, oppose everything she wants to. I'm anticipating her to protest a solar farm when she figures out that solar farms also displace certain biodiversity. Well,
she just hasn't figured that out yet.
Yeah. When the noise dials down, she probably will.
Problem here. Sorry, 1 minute. I have audio problem.
Uh-oh.
Oh, it's okay.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, it's okay. Luca sent at least 12 matches here.
Luke has been busy. Huh?
Oh, he's very funny. There's no energy transition. There's just addition. Oh, interesting.
Yep.
There
But the
should be
title-
energy addition.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the title, David gave this title for our podcast, so it's not.
Yeah,
for
I
me
mean
to
that's
suggest
what's
it.
happening, and frankly, it needs to happen. I mean, that's exactly what needs to happen. We need more of everything, and we're going to continue to need
That's
more of
right.
everything for a long time. And these efforts by these Malthusian environmentalists to kill major sources of energy are really counterproductive to the maintenance of human life, and people need to start calling that out
Yeah.
because that's a central philosophy in this movement, that we have too many
Yeah,
human
that's right.
beings on the planet. And so they're not really concerned about the fact that if you kill off fossil fuels, you can't feed everyone on the planet.
You'll kill people.
Right. You kill people, you reduce the population, and that's better for the earth. And the
Wow.
earth takes priority
Right.
over human life
Yeah.
among many of these people. And we need to bluntly call that out. And of course, that's not anything you're ever going to see an executive in the oil industry do, but we need more people speaking honestly about that.
It's amazing they don't lead by example. All these people who advocate for a smaller world population.
Sure. Go live like the Unabomber in the forest in Idaho, unconnected
No,
from
just
the rest
stop
of
living.
the world. And,
Solve the population problem by depopulating Earth by starting with yourself.
yeah, you go first. Right.
Well, if I could just add to Luca's point there, at the Natural Gas Summit, one of the American companies was saying that the new tone that they're hearing from policymakers about the transition is that they need all of the above. So they need the nuclear, the hydrogen, the
That's
gas,
right.
the
Good.
oil, the coal, everything, right?
Yeah.
So it was interesting that they're in a friendly crowd and they're saying, well, this is the new tone that we're experiencing here. So I mean that's good because that is the way it's been in history. It's not like we got rid of wood and we didn't get rid of coal. We just added on better things
right.
to the mix. And if I could just add something about the ESG, is that there was concern that there would be an antitrust case brought against the investment firms for the way that they were dealing with ESG, because they were behaving in many ways almost like a monopoly to push investment in a certain way. The UK, concerned about something similar, has now signaled that it will allow that kind of behavior if it's for climate change.
Of
And this
course.
was like,
Yes.
I think it was the UK secretary, or I can't remember exactly who it was. And I thought, well, wait a second. So antitrust only applies if it's a company or an industry you don't like, but it's
Right.
okay
Yeah.
if it's what you do. And that was,
Well, double
It's just
standards is
extraordinary.
the default setting
Yeah.
of the whole energy transition movement.
Right.
so true. Yeah. And if
So
I could
that's
just
the
add,
reason.
can I
Sorry.
just add one more thing? When you talked about the indigenous people of Norway, because one of the big good news stories in Canada is the indigenous people who are owners of the oil and gas resources, and they're working in the industry, they're developing it themselves, they're participating as owners in these projects. And they're saying, how can the Canadian government be promoting reconciliation at the same time they're trying to take away this ability for indigenous peoples to have economic strength and growth for their people? So it's a good news story, and at least it's pushing back a little bit against what the government is proposing in keeping oil and gas in the ground.
And that's a
Excellent.
positive thing in the United States as well. The Indian tribes and nations here in the United States, have ownership of their minerals, and where the government is trying to shut down oil and gas exploration, many of those tribal councils are pushing back, and they have a lot of authority in their reservations and their nations, and And so it's a very positive dynamic in our society.
That's probably the reason that Alexandria Cortez is suddenly approving, advocating nuclear energy.
Yeah, that was a shocker, wasn't it? I mean, she's never been what anyone would call an advocate for nuclear energy, but she went to Fukushima, saw that the horror stories that she'd been fed by activists about what's happening there. I mean, it's a tragic case. It was a huge disaster. But, you know, the whole area is not radioactive for 300 years or whatever the nonsense claim has always been. You know, that's a mystery to me too, isn't it? I mean, when we grew up, we were told that it was going to take the half-life of the radioactivity was something like 300 years, and yet, you know, I mean, Chernobyl's not overly radioactive anymore. That was just 20 years ago. Fukushima was just 13 years ago. People are living nearby. Wildlife and animals are flourishing. So what's the truth about radioactivity? I think we still suffer from a lot of misinformation in our news media and education system about that. But she learned firsthand by visiting on the ground, and suddenly is saying nice things about nuclear energy and maybe, you know, becoming a bit of an advocate for it, which is good for her. Yeah, it shows she's capable of evolving and learning, and that's a nice thing in a member of Congress.
Welcome to the reality. Yeah, that's right.
Faridun Barksley. It is difficult to say fact from fiction when it comes to energy transition. I reckon we got to put the house in order in energy transition. Yep. I mean, that's a really good point. We need more organization and honesty about what's really happening.
And acknowledging reality, which is what Alexandria Cortez did.
Luca. Substack from Robert Bryce. No, I didn't see it.
I haven't seen it.
Did it just come out this morning?
But you know, I know that's happening. And Robert is one of the greatest sources of real information about energy on the planet. Yeah. So I recommend everyone read it.
Wow. So even the Japanese are not averse to coal power. Imagine that.
Well, I mean, they have to have energy. They have to have real energy.
Absolutely, yes. Especially a country as resource poor as is Japan.
Yeah.
And with the price of natural gas being so high and all that competition for it, it kind of makes sense for them to want to do clean coal. And, you know, what I've heard is that Japan is extremely anxious about energy security. And if you have China building up on its border, and then there's the problem with Russia, you know, they need to make sure that they have some semblance of security for their own defense, let alone the operating also of their economy, which is extremely important. But
you talk about China. Just last year, China built enough new coal plants to power the entire kingdom of Great Britain, all the British Isles in 1 year. That's how much coal-fired electricity China built. So
they're approving 2 a day.
Temi, you mentioned some innovations that you can bring from the North American Natural Gas Summit. Was in Mexico, you mentioned?
No. So it was in Calgary, but next year it's going to be in Mexico.
Oh, great.
So they said it hasn't quite.
What are the innovations you mentioned before?
Well, they were talking about how they're doing hydrogen generation and that they're investing quite a lot of money into producing hydrogen from the natural gas, that they're doing floating LNG, which I know Germany has built, I guess, some floating LNG terminals, but this is something new for Canada. So they were very excited about how they're developing that. And then they were also talking about how this innovation for getting it to market. Because in Canada, for example, it's very difficult. The United States has all the terminals. And so Canada's trying to innovate to get our gas out through the United States until our pipeline is ready, because there's only going to be one. A second one, though, should be breaking ground in September, and that's a joint project with the Squamish Nation, which is an indigenous peoples in British Columbia. And they did the environmental assessment, they did all the reviews and stuff. So I hadn't heard of this project until this conference. It's been really under the radar, and I'm really surprised that they got permission, because the Canadian government has been holding off giving permission
Well,
to anything.
I mean, that's why I have such a confused look on my face. Wasn't it just November when the genius Prime Minister of Canada said there is no business case for LNG exports
I
in
was about to say
Canada
the
during a
same
meeting
thing.
with Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany? Am I misremembering that?
No, you're remembering it correctly. He did it twice. So in September it was with the German chancellor,
Okay,
and
it
in
was
November
September.
it was with the Japanese.
I got you.
So-
Okay, all right.
And he didn't tell the industry and the indigenous peoples that there is no
Apparently
business
not.
case. Yes.
Apparently not. Which is why it
Well-
was so shocking to know this project was going forward. It's like, wait a second. I thought there was no business case.
Oh my
And-
goodness.
I forgot to inform them. Yeah.
Yeah.
And David said that he is not going to CERAWeek next week, I suppose.
It's this week. It's kicking off
Oh.
today, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, I'm not able to be there. Just
What
too
do you
many
expect
other
to-
obligations.
What do you expect to have in terms of discussions in this event? Something
Exactly
special?
what we're talking about here: energy security. I interviewed
Yeah.
Dan Jurgen, who's the vice chairman of S&P Global, a month ago, and that's available for anyone who wants to go to the energy question and take a look at it. And he talked about energy security being a new focus, exactly what the points Tammy and Arena have been making, and that's going to be the focus of CERAWeek: how to enhance energy security while still continuing to work on reducing carbon emissions globally. And it's going to be, I mean, gosh, CERAWeek is the premier energy conference in the United States every year, and he was anticipating 6,000 in attendance this week, which is a return to near where it was before 2020. They had to cancel it in 2020 because of COVID. They tried to do it digitally in 2021, and
Yeah.
that was semi-successful. And then last year they held the conference in person with pretty reduced attendance, and so this year they're almost back at full strength, which is nice to see. And it's a gathering of all the movers, literally all the movers and shakers in the energy space. And so I regret I can't be there, frankly, but look forward to writing some stories about the events there.
Very good. So the conclusion could be that oil and gas industry are getting more organized to face the energy challenges.
I think they have to. I mean,
Yeah.
they kind of have no choice, right? Otherwise, they can't operate. And if I could just add one thing, my key takeaway from the conference, and it was something that a lot of the different presenters mentioned, was that they need to find a way to validate their responsible operations, because every time they say they're doing something, the environmentalists produce some ridiculous report saying they're not,
Yeah.
that they're greenwashing.
Oh.
And so now the industry is encouraging some form of assurance or validation for the things that they're doing, which to me is just another expense. And, the accountants will be jumping up and down. Yay, we can do that.
Yeah, and environmentalists will not be happy whatever the industry does.
Exactly.
right.
The only
Yeah.
thing they will be happy with is if the oil and gas industry ceases to exist. And
That's
that's
right.
clearly not happening. So,
No, it's not happening, and people,
but you can make everyone happy.
right, the senior executives in the industry who have thought for the last few years that their job is to manage the industry's decline should be rethinking that notion, because your industry is going to be around for another half century
Yeah.
at least, and you need to be managing how to meet increasing demand for your production. That's what you need to be managing to. You're going to long since be retired by the time the industry really starts to decline. And that's the reality everyone needs to manage to.
Yeah,
Great.
good point.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank
this
you.
meeting today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Great
Bye-bye.
week.
Bye. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
All right.